Stephen, America, JJ, Joey, Cold, Roger, is Tyler, Mitchell, and Marshall. All right. What we are going to do today is continue with medieval Europe. A couple of things. So I do have your exams to hand back to you, your Unit 4 exams, so I'll get those back at the end of class. I am going to have to let you go a little early. One, because I am fast losing my voice. And I thought that I could get through today, but last class just did me in a little bit. So we're going to go as far as we can today, but I also have a meeting that I have to go to that's downtown. So I'll let you go a few minutes early, but we will talk about the Middle Ages and continue talking about those on Thursday. Any questions about any of that? Okay. I have my throat lozenges. That tickle in your throat that you get when you have allergies, I hate that. So if I get your coughing fits, I do apologize, but it's that time of year. At the moment.
Oh yeah, Frothy the Snowman.
Oh. I was about to say that's a lovely Christmas sweater, but
It's my favorite one.
I can see that. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. So the last thing that we were talking about in here was feudalism. And there are a couple of things that I need to say about it. We didn't get all the way through it. So one of the things to keep in mind, sub and feudation, so how that division, how we're going to see that division. One king at the top, there is more than just one noble, so we're going to have several nobles here. Each of those nobles will have several vassals. Each of those vassals could have vassals of their own, all the way down to the peasant group, which, like I said the other day, was about 60% of the European population. As far as the peasants go, they are given land to work. They don't own the land. In fact, they have to pay rent to the lord who owns the land. If you've ever wondered how we get that word landlord, that is how we get it. It comes out of the feudal system. So they do owe rent to the landlord for working the land. If they're serfs and they're tied to the land, then if the land is sold, they are going to be sold along with it. There are a couple of ways that a serf can get his or her freedom. One, the landlord can grant it. That very rarely happens, but it did occasionally happen. So the landlord could grant it. If that was the case, the person was free. Of course, they had to find a way in life, so it wasn't like they were, free to do whatever they wanted. There was not a lot of economic mobility here. But the other way that a serf could get his or her freedom, they could leave and flee and live in another town for a year and a day. And if they lived in another town for a year and a day, and the landlord didn't find them and take them back to the land, they were considered free. But here's the problem with that. So they flee, they live in the town for a year and a day, but their oldest male relative back on the land had to compensate the lord for the loss of that labor, and the lord would determine the price. And if the guy left his family behind, the wife and the children would be turned out, and they wouldn't have any place to go. So I guess if he didn't care about his family, he could escape his freedom, but otherwise he's probably going to stay on the land, right? Widows who had not chosen a new husband after a few months, her first husband's death, would have the landlord choose a new husband for her. So if you were a woman, a serf and a woman, and your husband died, you were expected to get married very quickly, remarried very, very quickly, because the idea was, if you aren't remarried, that's a loss of labor. Like, you don't have a husband who's working that land, because it was considered the man's responsibility to do that, then you were costing the landlord that labor. So if you didn't choose a husband, then your landlord would choose a husband for you. And if you refused to marry that person that he chose, you would be thrown into jail until you did. So there weren't a whole lot of rights that serfs have or that peasants have. By the time we get to 1300 in England, we start to see some social shifts. Feudalism's still going to be around. Interestingly enough, anybody want to guess what kills feudalism? Yeah, it's what kills half the European population, right? It's the plague. Were you going to say that?
I was gonna say World War One.
Oh, no. No, feudalism dies out. Well, I say that. It actually lasted a little longer in Russia. Because, Russia's Russia. But feudalism in Europe, at least, will die out by the time we get to the 1400s. Or we start to see its demise by the time we get to the 1400s. It's not like it dies out from one day to the next. But it's because of the Black Plague. And we're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about the effect of the Black Plague on Europe on Thursday. I figured that was a good point in time to do it because it's the day before holiday week. Right? It's a holiday day, but it's a week. We get a week. It's exciting. I'm actually looking forward to it. So your instructors are looking forward to it too. But I thought that would be a good day. So I have a little clip to show you, and I have some sources to show you, and I want you to get in groups and talk about the effects of the plague on Europe. So we're going to do that on Thursday, so I'm not going to say too much about the plague right now. But that kills feudalism. So it takes that big an event to do away with this system. But regardless of feudalism staying around, we do see some social changes by the time we get to the 1300s and the mid part of the 1300s especially. England is a really good example, so we're going to use England as an example. So in 1300 in England, the population was about 5 million. We didn't have accurate census records at that point in time, but about 5 million. Interestingly enough, by the time we get to the end of the 1300s, the population was 2.5 million. You want to see the effect of the plague? That's a really good one. It goes from 5 million to 2.5 million in 100 years. Life expectancies kind of depended on where you lived. We talked about life expectancies in the Dark Ages. They weren't great. Well, they're not going to get better. If you were of the upper class and you lived in a fairly temperate part of Europe, you could plan on surviving until you were about 50. About 50. But if you were from a lower class, like a peasant class, the peasant class, your life expectancy was probably going to be anywhere from 30 to 40. Only 5% of the English population in 1300 was over the age of 65. If you lived to over 65, you were an exception. You were not the rule.
What percent?
5%. Yeah. 5% lived over the age of 65. The average height for men was about 5'7". For women, it was about 5'2", which is smaller than the average height today, although I am the average height of women in the Middle Ages. That's great. It's smaller. It's good to know. It's smaller than it is today, and part of that is malnutrition, because so many people didn't get the nutrients that they needed for body growth. They're going to be a bit smaller. Part of it may be hormones and food too. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. But people tended to be a bit smaller than they are today, just on average. Because people died sooner, they had to grow up faster, and they were considered adults faster. It was not uncommon for girls to marry at the age of 12. I mean, that would seem like that would be child abuse today, like marrying a girl at the age of 12. But because life expectancies were so soon, if you will, they married them at the age of 12. They weren't supposed to live as husband and wife until they reached the age of maturity, so about 14 or 15. But if your life expectancy is 30, by 15, you're middle-aged, right? So people grow up a little faster. All right. What about medieval women? Being a medieval woman, what was that about? Well, they didn't have a lot of rights. And part of that is because of the church, at that point in time, the church's view on women, the Catholic Church's view on women in the medieval period. They're going to be considered feeble, mean, and inherently sinful. And part of that comes from the story of Adam and Eve. And so Eve tempts Adam with the apple, and so the Catholic Church is going to base, in the Middle Ages, their view of women on that particular story. Independently minded women, there are a few examples that we have, but they're the exception, they are not the rule. There's this one interesting woman named Christina de Marquiat. No, you don't have to write her name down, she's just kind of an interesting woman. She lives from 1096 to 1160. Her parents arranged a marriage for her, but she says, I'm not marrying that guy. And she takes a vow of chastity and says, I'm not going to marry for the rest of my life if I have to marry somebody and have him be my overlord. I'm not going to do that. So what her parents decide to do is to lock her in a room with a guy, and the idea was that the guy was going to force himself on her and that she would have to marry at that point. She fights him off. She fights him off and makes it out of the room and runs away and gives lectures on chastity and lives her life as a hermit. She's an exception. There weren't a lot of opportunities for women in the Middle Ages who wanted to live separately or independently. There were pretty much two options for women in the Middle Ages. They could marry, and depending on what their social status was, if they were of the upper class, those marriages, a lot of them were arranged, or they could become a nun. Those were the two options, and there wasn't a third option in there. Well, I want to do this, I want to live separately. There really wasn't that third option in there. If they did marry, they tended to be several years younger than their husbands. They could be married, like I said, as early as 12. Teen marriage was quite common. Prior to the wedding, the banns would be announced thrice, so 3 times, giving people a chance to object. Like, no, they can't get married because he's married to a woman in another town. Or no, they can't get married because they're closely related to one another, or something like that. So there was an opportunity to object. If no objections were given, then they got married. There was a mass, then feasting, then they followed. The wedding party followed the bride and groom to the bridegroom's home. There was no divorce except for childlessness on the woman's part. They didn't acknowledge childlessness on the man's part. Contraception was forbidden, so women tended to have multiple pregnancies, and if they survived childbirth, then sometimes they could survive their husbands, especially if their husbands were older than they were. If they were wealthy, noble women, they didn't have a whole lot of opportunity apart from, staying inside the home, embroidery, being, somewhat of an entertainer, although the husband was considered the primary entertainer, but she, the wife, was going to be in charge of the household. Yes?
Could you say that the peasant women have more freedom in terms of than the noble women? It seems like the noble women are honestly kind of like high-class prisoners.
Cloistered away, yeah. In some ways, and when we talked about Roman women, we actually kind of talked about the same thing, because peasant women, even though you don't have a lot of rights at all, and it's hard work, there were opportunities to engage in conversations and those kinds of things with people outside of the home, sometimes more often than for noble women who would be kind of cloistered inside the home with other women.
Yeah.
But not necessarily, she wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to do that. And that was true in medieval times as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you are well-to-do and you don't want marriage or can't find a husband, more so your family can't find a husband for you, because most of those noble marriages were arranged. You would become a nun. And if you were from a wealthy family, what would happen is that the father would give a chunk of money to a nunnery, and they would take you in as a nun, and you could become an abbess or a prioress. So those were the high positions within that nunnery. That was probably the best thing for you, because you had an education available to you, or something like that. If you were poor, all you could be, if your father didn't have money to give, this was in place of a dowry. So if you got married, the father would give a dowry to the husband, but in place of a dowry, if you didn't get married, you would have this money go to the nunnery. If you were poor, all you could be was a lay sister. And this person performed tasks for the nuns so that they could devote themselves to prayer. And so they were kind of like the servants, if you will, in the nunnery. So that was all that was available to you. Alrighty. Any questions about that? Okay, so other kinds of social history that are really kind of interesting when we look at the medieval period. One of the things that really interests me is what people ate over time. And if you look at the medieval period, it's kind of interesting. Eating patterns are different. So today we generally have 3 meals a day, right? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Well, in this period of time, they generally had two meals. So they broke their fast, which by the way is where we get breakfast. So they broke their fast by having that morning meal, and then they had an evening meal. And depending on where you lived, depending on your social class, those meals were so different. If you were a peasant, you didn't have a lot available to you. You had seasonal fruits, seasonal fruits, I can talk today. Seasonal fruits, seasonal vegetables, so stuff that you could grow, but you didn't necessarily get to go to a store like we do today and have apples all year round or have stuff all year round like we do today. You had to eat what was available to you. And for those individuals who were peasants, so there was a harvest period and they planned ahead. So they salted meat or they canned or they did stuff like that. But by September, that started to run out. Like you had gone almost an entire year, and so September, October, before the next harvest, all of that was starting to run out. So those were seen as very lean months. In some cases, there was very little meat in the diet. Like you didn't see a lot of peasants consume a lot of meat. One of the reasons is because of dietary restrictions involved with religion. So if you weren't supposed to eat meat on holy days, then you couldn't have meat available to you. But the biggest reason is because they just simply didn't have meat available to them. For those peasants who had access to farm animals, the animals were more valuable to them alive than they were dead. Dead, you have a few meals and that's it. But alive, if you have a cow, you get what from the cow? Milk. You get what from the sheep? Wool. You get what from the chickens? Eggs. So all of these things are more important because you get these things over a long period of time versus killing the animal and eating a couple of meals. So they didn't necessarily do that. So they didn't have a lot of protein in their diets. One of the things that they did to try to add protein into their diets was to make what was called blood pudding. And so it was a pudding, but what they would do is to go up to a cow or sheep or and slice open a place on the animal's leg and bleed it a little bit and get some of the blood and then staunch the bleeding. And then they would put that in their pudding to get some kind of source of protein. I have no idea what that tastes like, but that was their source of protein. So they really didn't have a whole lot available to them. Bread was a staple, and this is going to be the case well into the 18th, 19th centuries. Bread was a staple of the diet. It was fairly cheap to produce. And it fills you up. Carbs fill you up, right? You eat enough bread, you're not going to feel hungry. Doesn't have everything that you need nutrition-wise, but you're not going to feel hungry. So bread is certainly a staple for a lot of those individuals living in medieval Europe. So that was the average individual's meal. What about if you were noble or wealthy? So I have a book here that I'm going to read just a little bit out of. It's called The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. It's really kind of fun. Excuse me. And gives you a sense of what it's like to live in medieval England. And one of the parts that I'm going to read to you describes a medieval buffet. So this is in a noble household. This would be a wealthy household. And I want you to compare this to what I just told you about the average person's diet. Okay, so it says, Let's suppose you have been assigned a place at the top table, along the bench to the right of the nobleman, a position of high honor. One servant, viewer, will pour the water. It is caught in a bowl beneath your hands by another servant. There is no soap. We'll get to medieval hygiene in just a minute. There is no soap, but a third servant will hand you a towel. Then grace is said by the Lord's chaplain, and the first course is brought in and placed before the Lord. He will take a trencher and start to help himself from the dishes laid before him. Once he has had a chance to try them, they're passed around. The first course normally consists of boiled and baked meats and sauces, perhaps ground meat in a spiced wine sauce or meatballs and aspic. An example of daily first course of 5 dishes served to a lord is brawn with mustard, a meat pottage containing beef or mutton, wine, herbs, and spices. Another meat pottage containing chicken or boiled pork, stewed pheasant or swan, and a meat fritter normally made with the entrails of animals. Leche Lombard is a popular first course dish consisting of pork, eggs, pepper, cloves, currants, dates, and sugar, all boiled together in a bladder like haggis, then sliced and served with a rich sauce. Another is mortrus, chicken and pork with breadcrumbs, powder forte, sugar, saffron, and salt. Perhaps you would prefer boiled venison with almond milk, onions, rice flour, and wine, colored in alkanet, a dark red root, and seasoned with powder deuce. The food is actually prepared in messes of 2 or 4 portions, which are then shared at the table. Several dishes might be set before you. Do not feel you have to empty a mess entirely onto your trencher. You are expected to leave a good portion of it left over. Leftovers, including the trenchers, will be given to the poor after the meal. Besides, with 5 different meat dishes to choose from, you could quite easily stuff yourself sideways in just the first few minutes of the first course. Resist the temptation to do this. Dinner will go on for about 2 hours. There will be 3 courses, each consisting of several dishes from which you pick tasty morsels, and each course will be separated by a small intervening course. It's like an intermission, an eating intermission, right? As you can see, food in a nobleman's household is not just about sustenance, it's about a matter of honor. After the first course of boiled or stewed meats and piquant sauces, there will be a short interlude for the serving of fruit, nuts, a subtlety, or intervening course. This is not always something to be eaten. Sometimes it is just to be looked at, especially during a great feast. Perhaps you will see the real 420 blackbirds baked in a pie. Bird lovers need not worry. The pie is baked first and allowed to cool. The birds are placed inside alive afterwards, so when the pie is opened, they do begin to sing and fly and swoop around the hall. The second course consists of roast flesh. This is where the Lord shows off with exotic meats delicately carved. There will be meaty pottages, meats in aspic, as well as a selection of roast venison, fawn, kid, baby rabbit, bustard, stork, crane, peacock, heron, partridge, woodcock, plover, egret, larks. The list could go on much longer. As the boys will tell you, every one of these animals has to be carved in its own particular way. A mallard is not carved, but unbraced. To cut up a hen is to spoil it. Herons are dismembered. That's terrible. Coaties unlaced, and so on. If you are young enough to be serving in the Lord's household, you will need to learn all these terms and how to wield a pair of carving knives. There are no forks. When the marshal of the hall directs you to sauce that capon, break that deer, or display that crane, you need to know which are the tastiest morsels for presentation to the Lord. This is not easy, especially with almost no light in winter except that shed by a rush light in the kitchen fires. Remember when picking out the tasty morsels during the second course to save some room for the third. The smallest, most delicate animals are normally served at this point, such as roast curlew, sparrows, and martinets, a kind of swallow. Alongside these, you might be served baked quinces, damsons and wine, apples with pears and sugar or syrup, fruit compotes, or a fruit pottage. The upper-class English are just as fond as their fruit as their underlings. Plums, damsons, cherries, and grapes are served before dinner to whet the appetite. Pears, nuts, strawberries, wineberries, apples, and mixtures of fruit tend to be served afterwards, as the season allows. Spiced baked apples and pears are popular, especially in winter. At the end, there will be a cheese course, if you still have room. With a drink of hibiscus, or spiced red wine, and wafers, the meal is finally over. Your trenchers and the uneaten remains are cleared away by the servants or boys, who then either surreptitiously eat the Lord's leftovers themselves, or pass them to the almoner for division among the poor, who may already be arriving at the manor gate.
Every day.
Pretty much. As season allows, so it would be seasonal. Yeah.
That sounds really good.
But yeah, and the idea was, we'll talk a little bit more about this. If you were one of the wealthy, you had to show that you were wealthy with varying degrees of extravagance, right? So yeah, that's very different from the peasant meal, right? So it kind of depended on your social class what you were going to eat. Now, keep in mind again, even if you were a noble, you were going to be held responsible for those religious dictums involving consumption of meat. So if you couldn't consume meat on holy days, then it would be fish instead. So they were responsible for those kinds of things too. Makes me hungry, actually. It's right before lunch, sorry about that. Go have pheasant with spiced wine sauce for lunch or something like that. As far as medieval hygiene, they actually do have some. I think medieval time period gets a bad rap because we kind of think that they don't bathe regularly. Well, they don't, but that doesn't mean that they're not concerned with cleanliness. So if they wash their hands with water, wash their faces with water, they consider that clean. It's not like today where we scrub everything down with Clorox wipes, right? Because we know about germs, we know about the stuff that we can't see that's still there, that still makes things dirty. Well, they didn't know about that. So in medieval times, if it looked clean and it smelled okay, must be clean, right? So one of the things, especially for upper class households that was very popular, was rose oil. So they would put it in their baths when they did take baths. They would use that as a way to sort of freshen things up because they didn't necessarily have soap like we do today. Yes?
I might be wrong. Did they have like lye soap or they stuff like that?
Eventually, yes.
And that's
So they
later
can
on?
make that. But that is pretty stringent stuff. I mean, that'll strip you. That'll take the germs off, but lye soap can be quite harsh. So they weren't necessarily going to use that every day, right? But they didn't necessarily have the kinds of soaps that we have today that would disinfect and those kinds of things. It smelled good, it looked good, but it was good, right? The other thing that's kind of fascinating, medieval wardrobes, medieval fashion. So I have a couple of pictures up here for you. And some of it can be quite extravagant. So up to a certain point, it wasn't necessarily the cut of the dress or the quality of the dress. It all had to do with color. That was up to about the 1300s, and early 1300s. So it was more about the color that you wore designating your social status in life versus the quality or the cut or the jewels or those kinds of things. For instance, nobility tended to wear purples or those kinds of things to sort of make sure that everybody knew they were of the noble class. By the time we get into the 1300s, this changes. So if you were to run into a town person or a noble, the styles would be similar because townspeople would want to emulate nobility, but the quality was different. And the kinds of materials used were different. So, for instance, if you were a king or a queen, these could be quite elaborate costumes. Here is a, oops, turn the page, sorry about that, a description of Edward III, King Edward III, King of England. He wore, quote, an outfit of green velvet, embroidered all over with pearls. His wife, Queen Philippa, wore, quote, a hood made of brown scarlet, studded with 154 stars of pearls and trimmed with gold. Each star being crafted out of 7 large pearls, with an especially large one at the top of each star. So nobility had to show that they were indeed nobility. For women, most of them are going to have their hair covered with this thing called a wimpet. So it was a piece of cloth that covered, and sometimes it went under the chin, and a circlet that kind of kept it into place. That was true after marriage. Before marriage, they didn't necessarily have to cover their hair, but certainly after marriage, they would have. Women could wear fairly form-fitting clothes, but they had to have their arms covered and they had to have their legs covered. The clothes could show the waist, they could accentuate the waist, but they could not show their legs, they could not show their arms, and so all of that is going to be covered. For men, they're going to wear this tunic kind of thing with tights, over tights, and that was true for quite some time. Those tights are going to stay in fashion for quite some time. It was seen as extraordinarily fashionable for men to show off their legs because that was a sign of virility. Whatever. So they show off their legs, and the other thing that they're going to do is to wear these extremely pointed shoes, like ridiculously pointed shoes. Like you can't even walk in them pointed shoes. And especially if you're nobles, you don't need to walk around because you're noble, right? You're not doing any work. So they would wear these extremely pointed shoes, and the pointier the better because that showed your station in life as well. As far as jewels, so jewels were for the well-to-do, not only to decorate, but also there was this belief in the medieval period that they meant something, like that they represented something. For instance, rubies, sapphires, diamonds, emeralds. Rubies were supposed to protect against poison. Emeralds against madness and sickness. Diamonds against, not against with, but for wisdom. So you wore diamonds for wisdom and no bad dreams. Pearls were for remembrance, those kinds of things. Yes?
Where do they come up with that stuff? Like,
That's a good
I've
question.
always been curious.
Because it's obviously not true, right? But keep in mind that one of the characteristics of the medieval period is superstition. So if somebody says, hey, I wore this ruby necklace and it protected me from this poison and whatever, then it becomes a popular thing for people.
I was just curious because, I mean, in Egypt, it was like the same.
Yeah, and it's
And-
not necessarily going to come from there, but the idea that there is sort of a mystical protection that certain things are going to provide you, we still see that today. I don't know that people carry around little rabbit's feet anymore. I used to when I was a kid. It was pretty morbid. But the idea of the rabbit's foot for luck or the four-leaf clover for luck or those kinds of things, I mean, we still see that today. We're going to see it back then in kind of an expanded way. Yeah. Yes?
And people still do carry around real rabbit's feet.
Yeah.
Anytime you go to a place that like sells hunting things, you can find rabbit feet.
Rabbit's feet. Interesting. So I was in New Orleans, this was several years ago, and going in different shops. One of them was this voodoo magic shop, because you have to go into that store. And they were selling alligator feet. And I've forgotten what they stand for, like what you're supposed to get when carrying an alligator foot, but they were like real alligator feet. I'm like, oh, okay.
I think they're supposed to be for good
So,
luck.
I think so. I think it's like a rabbit's foot. So you still do see those kinds of things. Maybe not as big, but you still do see those kinds. All right. Any questions about that? So wimpet covering married women's hair. Not necessarily going to be about color. And by the way, the other thing to keep in mind, I think that surprises people, the peasants don't have like a uniform. There isn't a peasant uniform that they wear. They're going to try to wear colors too. They're going to try to wear things that aren't necessarily, that are somewhat fashionable. I mean, they're not going to just not care about their appearance at all. I think that's important to note. but also clothes that are functional. You're not going to see peasant men in those stupidly pointed shoes. I mean, that's just not going to work. But they don't have a uniform that they're going to wear that, you know, is the peasant clothes, the dull brown, that kind of thing. They try to add color if they can. So that's important to know. Okay, so by the time we get to this period of time, even before then, we're going to start to see certain rulers in some of these countries like England, like France, try to, in some ways, manipulate the feudal system. They're not going to do away with the feudal system, but one of the things that was concerning for those rulers, the feudal system does give a lot of authority to the nobles. So the nobles are over large tracts of land. They have people who are going to be beholden to them in some way, pay them taxes, give them military service. It can make them very powerful. It can have very powerful nobles. And that's certainly a concern to the king. So one of the things that we start to see, especially in places like England, especially in places like France, those kings start to find ways to consolidate their power a little bit. Take away some of the power of the nobles, make their own way, or make rules that consolidate that authority under them. And to varying degrees of success. We're going to start with England first. And whenever you start with England, what you have to start with is, of course, the Norman conquest. Because when we talk about the monarchy in England, it dates from here. Before this point in time, 1066, the Normans were, they weren't there. The Normans were in France. And this was Anglo-Saxon England. And the Anglo-Saxon system of government, they do have a king, but it's a bit different. It's a bit different from what we're going to see when this guy named William the Conqueror comes over. Yes.
So wait, is the Normans, are they the French or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so William, Duke of Normandy, is Duke of Normandy, which is a region in France. So yeah, I mean, he's going to come over from France and conquer Anglo-Saxon England and change England in a pretty profound way. But I'm going to stop there. Told you I'd have to let you go early, and I'm feeling that's off my throat already. So what we're going to do on Thursday, we will talk about William Duke of Normandy.